Hi there and welcome to this special 4-part series, Managing ESG Risk, produced by Art of Procurement in partnership with Dun Bradstreet. I'm Philip Ideson, the host of Art of Procurement. I'm joined over the course of this series by Brian Alster, the General Manager of Finance and Risk Solutions, and Rochelle March, the Head of ESG Product, both at Dun Bradstreet. We'll dig into the emerging imperative for procurement to understand the ESG profiles of their suppliers and provide actionable tips and recommendations on how to manage ESG in the context of broader supplier and supply chain risk management. In part 2 of this series, I'm joined by both Rochelle March and Brian Alster to discuss how procurement can think about onboarding suppliers with both risk and ESG in mind. We met Rochelle in part 1 of the series, so I started part 2 by asking Brian to provide a little bit more about his role at Dun Bradstreet.
Sure. Thank you again, Phil, for having me. I'm excited to be here and talk about ESG and its role in the supply chain. My name is Brian Alster. I've been with Dun Bradstreet for about 11 years. Before I came to Dun Bradstreet, I really cut my teeth on the risk side of the business at 2 large financial institutions, JP Morgan and Bank of America. Since I've been at Dun Bradstreet for the last 11 years, I've held leadership roles in our sales organization, our product organization, and now I am general manager for our largest business unit, which is finance and risk. Finance and risk encompasses all the different types of risks that a company has to review in order to ensure that they have strong policies and processes. So anything from credit and trade risk all the way up to ESG compliance risks, cyber risk, and so that we can provide a broad range of tools to help companies mitigate risk across their business.
And I'm sure there's not a day that goes by when there's not additional risks that are added to that portfolio. As you know, there's obviously where we are in the world right now, there's risk is becoming an ever more important topic within supply chain.
Absolutely. In my old roles, when I was with the banks, the regulators, it was always a difficult conversation. Today, the regulators are now our friends in creating these tools that we're helping companies to figure out how to overcome and mitigate the risks associated with them.
Now, one of the big themes in procurement, over the past year has been supplier experience. It's something we've talked a lot about on Art of Procurement. And Brian, I'm going to ask this question to you first. What should we keep in mind with regards to supplier onboarding and risk and disruption?
Yeah, first and foremost, with supplier risk and supplier onboarding, it's really over the last several years moved from a reactive tool to a proactive tool. Just in the last 2 years alone, with natural disasters, the pandemic, the port disruptions in the Suez Canal, and now we have them on the west coast of the United States, we have them in China, we have them on the east coast of the United States. We're seeing them really globally. Companies have to take a much more proactive role to understanding what risks they have in their supply chain and how to proactively mitigate those risks.
Right. And I want to ask the same question to you, Rochelle. We talked in the first episode of this series about, about ESG and environmental social governance and a little bit more detail there. As you think about ESG in the context of supplier onboarding, like what should the supplier experience look like?
Sure. Well, there's the ideal of what the supplier experience should look like, and then kind of what it's like today for most suppliers, simply because ESG is rather nascent, it's maturing, and it's becoming just as important as some of those risk factors that Brian mentioned earlier, but it still isn't as defined as previous risk management strategies and risk assessment strategies have been in the past. So in an ideal universe, a supplier would know exactly what type of environmental, social, and governance metrics and performance factors it would need to provide in order to complete and satisfy any type of onboarding requirements. Today, though, that really varies. There may be some defined metrics that are provided. There may be many that are asked that a supplier is asked to provide, and can be quite onersome on the supplier to do so. Or it could be a general, please showcase a indication of your ESG performance. And this could be very general. It could be simply responding to energy management or attaching a statement of sustainability policy or something like that. But ideally, it's clear, it's defined, and it's something that's also achievable for suppliers to do so that they can be part of that onboarding process.
Yeah, that achievable point, I think, is really important as well, isn't it? Because oftentimes we run the risk of asking for too much information, and then that becomes, it's unreasonable sometimes to ask for so much and put that burden on a supplier.
Totally, especially when, that supplier may be supplying tens, hundreds companies. If they're all asking different things, this can be quite problematic, definitely.
And one thing to add to that, Phil, I think what we've seen when we speak to customers, one of the biggest challenges they have is that they break down the supplier onboarding process and the risk assessment process into two phases. One is the data collection, and the other is the ability to translate that data into an inherent risk profile. And their concern is they never want to take on too much data, because if there's some data that they can't use or they can't translate into a risk assessment, then that data is wasted. And so they're trying to figure out how to find that right balance between how much data I need and what data I can use to actually impact my risk assessment to change the risk profile of that entity that I'm onboarding.
Right. And I think that's important, is actually taking action on that data as well. And not just gathering it for the sake of gathering it, especially during the onboarding process. And perhaps, as close as you can get to when you need it, even if it's in making sourcing decisions, as opposed to, hey, we've made a sourcing decision and now we're going to go and gather some data, where you may not be able to action it, which are all things to kind of consider at the point of which you're gathering this information.
Absolutely.
Now, when we talk about the data related to risk, and Brian, I'm going to pose this to you. Should we be looking to suppliers to provide the data, or should they be pulling that from external sources? Like, what's the balance there?
It's a really good question. So as we've been working with clients at Dun Bradstreet, we're really focusing on trying to help them automate as much of the process as possible. Procurement and global sourcing organizations know they're viewed as a cost center. So they're being asked to do more with the same amount of resources or less. And so automation is a key format of that, and a key driver of helping them to mitigate costs associated with the increased workload that they have. So utilizing third-party data is a critical first step in being able to automate a lot of that data, so that when they enter some information about a supplier, there's a lot of information that can be appended to that initial lookup that they can get from multiple third parties. And then from there, they can use a portal system to collect any necessary remaining information or documentation that they need to help complete their risk assessment. But here, technology takes a front seat in helping them automate as much of the process as possible and relying on self-reported information from the suppliers as much as possible.
Yeah, and that comes, you talked about the speed of doing that, which is obviously really important, but I think there's something about the trust of the data as well. A challenge that I think procurement has a lot of times is, the trustworthiness of supplier information. Not that it's not trustworthy, but it can't necessarily be validated and verified.
Absolutely.
So one of the benefits of getting it from a variety of third-party sources is that it's gone through that validation and verification process.
It's absolutely correct.
Now, from a ESG perspective, Rochelle, business is obviously changing very quickly. ESG requirements are changing very quickly. Now, how often should an organization be expected to kind of keep a track of their supply ESG scores or update their suppliers' ESG scores?
Sure. So again, things are forming, right? And I'm sure there's going to be increased expectation on this, to the point where, as supply chains, regulation, stakeholder expectations evolve, the frequency will likely increase. So today, you see an expectation to at least have an annual update of supply chain, mostly to be processed into the annual sustainability report or some type of annual review process that's happening. And so that's kind of the most common time period we have. However, we are seeing demand to understand anywhere from I want this, every month, every week, to I want to know as a procurement officer exactly when there is a very radical news article or some type of risk component, even if it cancels out exactly real time, exactly. And it's a fine balance, because do you want the whole novel of data and information so you completely understand it, or do you want a quick snippet, a sound bite to, in order to summarize all of what's happening across a pretty large portfolio most of the time? So it really is a balance. So I think in terms of suppliers, just updating data as soon as there is an update, as soon as information has changed, is just going to be putting them in a better position to accommodate a more frequent expectation of data delivery.
And really following up this kind of a similar question that I had for Brian, how what should kind of be some of the sources of that data? Should that be, are you looking for suppliers to update, information that translates into changing ESG scores, or are you looking at, external sources again that's pulling in data from different areas that will then inform and update those scores?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think the first point of that is going back to my earlier comment. We want to rely as much as possible on data that we can collect from third parties, because we can verify it, we can automate it, and we can bring that information in a more real time to impact the risk profile. But ideally, we would have an annual survey that would go out, or questionnaire, to validate some of the self-reported information that we gathered, and that the majority of the data would be collected from a third party, so that we can start to verify it, that we can build automation into those processes, so that as information comes in real time, we can determine whether or not it would impact the risk assessment, and then push that information proactively to a company to see whether or not they want to take action on how they're interacting with that entity based on the new information.
And so from the procurement perspective, is it fair that they can expect to access real-time ESG score updates, if they so choose to want to do that? So it's not a limitation of the availability of real-time scores, like scores are static, but it's more an internal conversation of how often do we need to know what the latest status is?
Yeah, I would rephrase it as from real time to as new information comes in.
Right.
New information may come in monthly, it may come in weekly. We may bring in information today that we didn't have yesterday, and we would pass that through as a signal to help them, in an alert to let them know the risk profile has changed. I think that's what's most important, right? So it's I like the way Rochelle phrased it earlier. Historically, it used to be we get the information, we put it in a drawer, and next year we look at it again. It needs to be much more real time than that, but it doesn't necessarily have to be, again, immediately every piece of information that they want to take in, they would take in real time. It's really as it comes in, and as we get more and more verified data, we'll be able to provide updates more frequently based on the verified data sources that we get.
And so my final question today, we talked at the beginning a little bit about supplier experience and the kind of role of supplier experience when you're thinking about onboarding your suppliers. But Brian, I just wonder if there's any kind of final thoughts or advice that you can share for how procurement can be thinking about that onboarding process in the context of supply chain risk management.
Of the clients that Dun & Bradstreet interacts with, those that are most mature in the supply chain risk management process are ones that are playing off of their front foot. So they tend to be more proactive in a couple of things. One, not only understanding their primary or first tier suppliers, but they also have a good, strong understanding of their secondary and tertiary suppliers that are further down in the supply chain. That's number one. Number two, they've determined which of their primary and secondary and tertiary suppliers are critical suppliers so that they can spend more time understanding what the possible risks are, whether that's geographic risks, political risks, climate risks, and being able to react to them. And then those that are most mature on the spectrum have proactively identified alternative suppliers that they can pivot to mitigate risk. Even the best supply chain risk management processes and policies can't completely eliminate risk in the supply chain, but the best ones tend to mitigate it and have the least amount of impact on the bottom line.
Thanks for listening to Managing Supplier ESG Risk, a special series from Art of Procurement and Dun Bradstreet. To listen to all 4 episodes in this series, go to artofprocurement.com/ESG Risk. That's artofprocurement.com/ESG Risk.